Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. The NDP have repeatedly said that Albertans had a conversation about the direction of our province during the last general election. The NDP bragged about that, and under their plan, the majority of Albertans would not be hit with new tax increases. They boasted that Albertans gave them the mandate to implement their agenda that they brought forward during the election. And when pressed, they assured Albertans that taxing businesses and high-income earners would solve Alberta's fiscal situation. Today, it's clear that that is no longer the case. At no point during the provincial campaign did Premier Rachel Notley promise that every single Albertan would see prices at the pump jump another 7 cents a litre if the NDP were elected, and that's on top of the gas price increases in the budget. At no point did they promise Albertans their power bills would go up. In fact, I remember Ms. Notley and Brian Mason once fighting for lower rates for consumers across Alberta. Today, they are implementing a tax and a restructuring of our electrical system that could lead to the most dramatic power price spike in Alberta's history. At no point did the NDP say they would raise the cost of heating the average home by $230 a year, but that's what they did yesterday. And they promised the price would continue to go up. The new economy-wide carbon tax will cost the average household in Alberta at least $500 more a year just to heat their homes and drive their cars. That does not include electricity, and it doesn't include the impact of the carbon tax on the price of everything else as businesses pass it along to their consumers. Albertans will be hit hard by this tax on everything. And anyone under the illusion that this tax on top of everything else will not hit the economy hard just is not listening. Today, the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors said that without reducing royalties, the new carbon taxes have, quote, effectively reduced Alberta's competitiveness and future employment through additional costs, end quote. And remember, this $3 billion tax grab is on top of the $1.5 billion increase in the budget. The NDP will try to tell Albertans their new tax will be revenue neutral. This is simply untrue. The fact that the proceeds of this new tax will be spent in Alberta does not make it revenue neutral at all. In British Columbia, a carbon tax resulted in lower income taxes for everyone. Taxing carbon instead of income has some merits, but that's not what the NDP are doing here in Alberta. A carbon tax means middle-class Albertans will all take a hit to their pocketbooks and for the money to decide where to spend. The so-called adjustment fund will do little to soften the blow for Albertans and businesses reeling from this new carbon tax and the slate of poor NDP economic policy we've already seen since May. Yesterday's report leaves the option wide open to be spent on, quote, other government priorities, end quote. This means it will not flow back to Albertans. Ms. Notley clearly said yesterday that one of those options will be helping pay the rising cost of the provincial debt. On the accelerated shutdown of coal plants in Alberta, let me say this. Wildrose has always advocated moving towards lower carbon intensity fuels and renewables. It's been our policy for years. It's a great policy, and we wish the NDP would adopt it. But in homes and communities across Alberta, this NDP policy will have a serious negative impact. There is no more clarity on those losing work will be, and I quote, treated fairly, end quote. After yesterday's announcement, it's unclear who will be bearing the majority of the costs to shut down our coal-powered generation. Consumers as consumers, or consumers as taxpayers through government bailouts. One or the other will happen. And without any serious market-based leadership on providing cost-effective alternatives, this move will just be another line item added to the escalating costs of the NDP's risky economic agenda. Are there aspects of this climate change plan that we can support? Yes, there is. Working within the market and government to improve energy efficiency is a very admirable goal. Improving research and innovation and supporting our renewables industry is also very important and laudable. Certainly something that the Wildrose has stood up for in the past. But let's take stock of where Alberta stands today. At least 65,000 jobs lost, likely much, much higher. Wages are being cut, consumer debt is up, Drilling is significantly down. Investment is even further down. And with the results of a royalty review expected next month, things are likely to get much, much worse. This carbon tax will make it more difficult for any industry to do business in Alberta. It will make it far more expensive. This will hurt Alberta's economy. And for every single Albertan sitting around their kitchen table who does have a job, it means less money to spend on their priorities, less money for their family. Oh, and by the way, as if to add insult to injury, this massive carbon tax won't actually cut overall greenhouse gas emissions at all. In 2013, Alberta emitted 267 megatons. Under this plan in 2030, after 15 years of this plan and $45 billion in taxes, the government is projecting that Alberta will emit 270 megatons. You can look it up on page 40 of their report. One of the #1 jobs of our government should always be focusing on helping the Albertan who is out of work, sticking up for the family, seeing their wages go down and the cost of living go up. After yesterday's new carbon tax, things are going to get a lot worse for Albertans, even worse than they already are under the current NDP policies. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So how would the Wildrose issue, you said during the debate and election campaign, you thought that you're saying climate change is a real problem. You think it's a real problem. So how do you actually then reduce significantly Alberta's emissions?
Thanks, Graham, for that question. I was very clear during the election that we believe man-made climate change is real. Our policy on the environment has always been very clear. We believe that we can use our low-cost natural gas strategy to provide incentives for renewables, but also to move forward with something that costs Albertans very, very little compared to the rest of the world, and something that is clean burning, which is natural gas.
Okay, but would that actually, you made an interesting point, a fair point, that this isn't going to actually reduce emissions for years.
It's not going to reduce emissions at all under their plan.
Right. But then
in fact, it increases.
Do you have a plan? Like very often the Wildrose has a shadow budget. Is there a shadow climate change strategy to show how you would actually then reduce the emissions?
Well, we had a 5-step plan during the last campaign, and part of that plan was a natural gas strategy. We would be very aggressive in our natural gas strategy. We think that's a much better plan than moving forward with what they're moving forward with, which is a carbon tax that actually increases cost to Albertans but doesn't do anything as far as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. A natural gas strategy, because of our abundance of it, would actually do that.
It would actually reduce emissions overall.
It would reduce the intensity for certain.
Sorry, but not the actual emissions. Intensity, absolutely, I agree with you, but actually bending the curve as the government keeps talking about, would yours bend the curve?
It would bend the curve. We have to start somewhere to bend that curve, and right now the NDP's plan is not moving at all in that direction. We would move in that direction, and the natural gas strategy gives us that opportunity to do so. Graham, as you know, we pay much less than the world does for natural gas, and we believe that that strategy moving forward is an aggressive strategy that we should implement, and that means science and technology. It also means actually having concrete plans to move forward with that, and you will see that in the future, Graham, as far as how we would do that specifically, but we will save that for the opportunity for Albertans to vote on that in the next election.
So where would you stand though in terms of the coal-fired generation? Do you want to phase that out more gradually, not at all? Do you want to have the natural gas work alongside it?
Well,
where's the Wildrose stand on coal, I guess is my question.
let's be clear, there was 30 communities last week that stood up against the accelerated shutdown of coal. The very fact that they would move forward with 6 additional coal-fired plants to be shut down means that Alberta communities will be shut down. It means that further communities will, and Albertans will be out of work. But let's be clear, and this is one thing that seems to be missed by our Premier. That is that Alberta does not need to take lessons from anybody in relation to our environmental performance. We are a leader in the world in environmental performance, whether it be in reclamation work or oil refining and upgrading. We are world leaders, and coal, to accelerate coal shutdown in Alberta while the United States is still using an abundance of coal and have no alternative plans. We are cleaner than the United States. We are certainly cleaner than China and other jurisdictions. We don't need to take lessons on that, and to accelerate 6 additional plants simply means that our economy is going to take further hit. We don't believe that that's necessary at this stage. We need to be in lockstep with the Americans on our strategy, and we are currently ahead of them. That's why we're wondering why Rachel Notley and the NDP are frankly moving forward with this very aggressive plan that nobody else in the world is moving forward with. And certainly it's going to have a detrimental effect on our industries and our employment when Albertans are looking for a job and have no job, it's going to be pretty hard to be an example to the rest of the world as we have been in the past.
Do you have concerns about where this $3 billion carbon tax is going?
Well, we know where it's going. It's going into the pocketbooks of bureaucrats and politicians to decide where they want to spend it. There is no specific allocation except for to go into general revenues, in essence. They talk about some science and technology and other grandiose schemes, but they don't have any specifics on it. And in fact, we believe that it's just one more tax grab to increase revenues and take the money out of Albertans with some form of excuse on why they're doing it. But it is simply more of a tax grab to use in general revenues.
What effect will
They
this?
say it's not going into general revenue.
That's not my understanding. And in fact, I think specifically, I have a quote specifically on one in relation to where it is going and where it's not. I think it said other priorities was the quote, unquote, I believe. But I can get that to you, Darcy, if you like.
What effect will the hard cap have on the oil sands, do you think?
Well, it certainly gives a competitive advantage to the existing oil sands plants. Those plants that are currently situated in Alberta and that are operating, they will have a competitive advantage. We don't know exactly how those priorities are going to be decided by the government and who is the winner and who is a loser, but certainly to reduce the opportunity for future expansion will mean that we have many less players looking at the opportunity of moving into the oil sands sector.
Do you think the government has struck the right balance in terms of the expectations on individual consumers versus the expectations on industry and companies? Should consumers have to sort of step up so much as they are being asked to? Or do you think that there does need to be sort of a balance between the two?
Well, let me just quote the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drillers again. And I quote, "Alberta is one of the highest cost jurisdictions in the world to operate. The introduction of new carbon taxes, unless offset by lower royalties, has effectively reduced Alberta's competitiveness and future employment through additional costs," end quote. I don't believe the balance right now by this government is correct. What they are doing is they are allocating all of the impact of this carbon tax back to Albertans, and it means that there will be less money in Alberta's pockets to deal with those things they want to on a daily basis. And it certainly means not only less income in their pockets, but less jobs, because ultimately, with the less competitiveness of Alberta's industry, it will mean less jobs here in Alberta, and less companies, and less payments to shareholders.
But other industry
One more
leaders are
question,
signing
guys.
off on it, so how do you reconcile the two?
Well, very simply, I don't. I work for Alberta taxpayers and Alberta citizens. I do not work for Alberta's large industries, including the oil industry. I work for Albertans, and I stand up.
You'll cite some, Brian, you'll cite some saying that they have a problem with the plan, but you're not, what about the ones who are signing up on the plan?
Well, I think being from Fort McMurray and anticipating what the NDP government was going to bring in, I think most Alberta oil sands companies, for instance, are just happy that they're going to be able to continue operating in Alberta. So I would suggest that based upon some of the comments that I've had, they're happy that they haven't had the opportunity removed them completely to operate here. But
I'm sorry, but was that ever an option in your mind that they thought they were going to be shut down by the NDP?
after listening to the NDP in Ottawa, yes, I did believe that was an option, and I do believe that this is a regressive, a particular penalty on oil sands producers that's much more disadvantageous to them than other industries.
Okay, last question,
Sorry,
please.
and so you thought then that the NDP provincially was going to shut down the oil sands?
Through a series of taxes, yes.
And speaking of taxes, you mentioned the BC.
It comes down to competitiveness, Graham, and we are already in the highest cost jurisdiction in the world to be competitive with oil.
I'm sorry, just to follow up, you mentioned BC, I guess you mentioned the BC, the carbon tax in BC was better than what's happening here. Would you want a tax like the BC carbon tax or the fuel tax here in Alberta as opposed to the way the NDP has done it?
Well, we certainly think it would be we saw actually income taxes reduced in British Columbia when they brought in a carbon tax, and it certainly would be a better alternative than what we have here. That isn't somewhat neutral to taxpayers, but here it's just an increased tax burden.
Okay, so I'm sorry, if you were in power, would you bring in a tax like the BC government has done?
What I wouldn't do is bring in this carbon tax that's going to tax everything and increase costs to Albertans another $500 per year.
Okay, thanks
So,
everyone.
Brian, I
Thank
have to clarify though, are you saying that the only reason the industry leaders are signing off on this plan is because they have this sword of Damocles of a total shutdown hanging over their heads, so anything's better than what was supposedly being held in abeyance?
But let's be clear. I've mentioned before, I do not work for the large oil companies. I work for Albertans. I clearly see right now, based on our calculations and most experts' calculations, that this is going to cost Alberta families another $500 per year. The oil companies have to stand up and voice their own positions, their own opinions. I've given you one quote from one particular sector of the economy. Why they would stand up behind the NDP is up to them to explain, not up to me. But I work for Albertans. I don't work for large oil.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.